Hey everybody, welcome to the Wonderful World of Remnant Radio. In this program, I've got Josh Butler with us, and we're going to be discussing the Gospel of John. I mean, in large part, but we're going to be talking about how, God's on our side, not against us. It's going to be a fun program. You guys stay tuned. Hey guys, Joshua Lewis here with the Remnant Radio. Thank you so much for tuning back in. So much stuff going on here at Remnant. We've got conferences, we've got courses, we've got Patreon content, we've got all kinds of extra stuff that's being released here on the podcast. And if you want to stay up to date on all the things Remnant Radio, best way to do that is to subscribe to the newsletter. A link of it can be found in the description of this video, or you can go over to theremnantradio.com. There on the homepage, we have a newsletter sign up. You sign up for that, man, you'll get all kinds of cool discounts and early bird codes to your inbox. Also get free ebooks that we've been releasing here on the podcast. So lots of really cool stuff. Without further ado, I want to introduce you to my new friend. Just met him, Josh Butler. Hey, buddy, tell me a little about yourself and your ministry for people who aren't super familiar with you.
Oh, what's up, man? It's so great being with you on this, Josh. Yeah, so a little bit about me. So I'm a pastor in the Portland area, a church called Willamette, Christian church, kind of family of churches here in the area. And my wife Holly and I have been married about 19 years with 3 kids, teenagers right now, and a couple different books. So my first book was called The Skeletons in God's Closet, which tried to help Christians who were maybe grappling with some of the tough topics of the Christian faith, things like hell, judgment, holy war, kind of going, man, God is good, but man, these things kind of make me question, is he really good if these things are true? And so premise of that one was just going like, dude, trying to offer some paradigm shifts for going, there's some caricatures out there of how we can tend to think of God when it comes to these topics. So trying to reclaim a healthier, biblical, historic, kind of robust understanding where we go, oh, God is good, not in spite of these topics, but even in and through them, we can see the goodness of God shining through and through. And I'd say, a couple different books and ministry since then, that's been a theme, has just kind of been what I call paradigm shifts, going, how do we confront some of the caricatures that are out there and reclaim a healthier, richer kind of understanding of the God of the gospel and the historic Christian faith, where we see really a greater confidence that we can reclaim in the goodness of God, the character of God, even by diving into some of the tough topics. Yeah.
I love that. And today we're talking about your book, God is on Your Side, which, I mean, essentially it seems to be going through the Gospel of John and looking at all the hard passages, the places where we need to do those paradigm shifts where, hey, God's not a bully in this situation. He's actually doing the good and right thing for our good, for his glory, that concept. We talked a little bit offline just about your background and some of the spiritual gift stuff, but even in the introduction of your book, you kind of mentioned some, prophetic letdowns, those sorts of things that kind of framed some of the introduction to this book. Would you kind of unpack some of that for us?
Definitely, man. Yeah, because the premise is kind of, man, is God on my side? Is he actually for me? And it's easy to answer yes when life is going well and things are running along good. But man, when things take a turn for the worse, it can be tough. I found myself asking, God, are you really on my side at multiple seasons of my life? Man, one was when our 5-year-old daughter had a psychotic break. So it's kind of a long story, but we spent 10 days in the hospital, 6 months with specialists, and we were worried that we'd lost the girl we loved to the moon and back forever. And just found ourselves going, man, God, I know you're with me. I know you're for me, but really, trying to navigate that season. There was another season some years back where I went blind in my right eye, and the doctors were concerned, depending on the cause, that my left eye could be coming soon too. And so I began facing just the fears of, dude, am I going blind? They said, you need to brace yourself. You're likely going blind. And so facing that fear over the next year of, dude, what if I can't see my kids' faces as they grow up? What if I can't read and write the way I know how and even do my job, like stuff that the way that I've known how, man, it just felt threatening even to like vocation and a sense of calling and all. And God, are you really for me? Are you really, what in the world is going on right now? Or, even the season kind of leading into the writing of this book, for the first time in my life, faced suicidal thoughts, and it was coming out of probably the most brutal season of my life, like a time that, man, it was just a dismantling of our job, our stability, community. We ended up picking up and moving back home, just went through a really difficult season, that just a lot of loss of community and network and a number of different things, and found myself going, like, entering kind of a dark night of the soul of going, God, I trust you, but I don't trust my understanding of you right now, because man, our world just feels like it's just blown up, and where are you in the midst of this? And where do you go when you're facing stuff like that? Well, one place I'd love to go is the Gospel of John, man, because I just feel like the picture there of Jesus, these scenes are so powerful. And I found myself kind of going like, oh, not just like these one-on-one encounters that people have with Jesus in the Gospel of John. I found a guy going, hey, don't just think of this as like this thing that happened way back then, a history lesson or whatever. Like this is actually a window, like an iconic kind of window or scene into like you, like finding myself in these one-on-one encounters, like in this character, almost like a representative, where the invitation to see Jesus seeing you, like to see him seeing me, my condition. And so that's kind of part of the heart of the book, is helping us to re-encounter Jesus through the Gospel of John, seeing ourselves in these scenes and seeing Jesus seeing us. And yeah, man, and encountering the God who is more than we could ever imagine, like with us and
Mm,
for us and on our
mm.
side.
No, I love that, and I happen to be preaching through the Gospel of John at my local church, so I'm in chapter 6. So a lot of the stuff that we're covering today, I've done some reading on, and I'm really encouraged by the amount of patristic sources that you seem to be inspired by as you're running through the material. I'm over here going, I don't know if the patristics are right, but I do like to tell my audience what the early church fathers have been saying about these texts for a while. One of the texts that I stumbled through, I want to say Gregory the Great. I think it was Ambrose. Those are the two that I can recall off the top of my head. And I could be wrong on those sources because it's been a couple of months since I've preached the text. But when John comes on the scene and he says, I'm not worthy to untie his sandal, both
Mhm.
those church fathers made a connection between that passage and the passage in Ruth and in Deuteronomy, where there's like this public shaming ceremony for, it's a levirate marriage law. If he refuses to marry his brother's sister after he's passed, she can come in, take his sandal off, and like spit in his face. But there's something to do with the sandal that has to do with the right of redemption and levirate laws. So
Mhm.
they go to Ruth and they say, look, when Boaz goes to redeem Ruth, he goes to the next of kin and takes off his sandal. And I was like, oh, what an interesting concept, because I've always heard this had to do with like foot washing and like not worthy of like even being his servant. But some of the early church fathers come on the scene and they're like, no, I think this has to do with John saying, I'm not the bridegroom. And then you jump
Yes.
into chapter 2 and he's like he mentions that he's this bridegroom motif again, where he's like, hey, we rejoice because of the joy of the bridegroom. So some of those
Whoa,
like paradigm shifts have been really cool to kind of pick up on and pull from patristic resources. And again, I'm over here going,
dude.
at times I just go, some of it's good, sometimes I go, maybe not. But tell me, if you would, just kind of like, I want to pick your brain. What have been like really good, like early church sources as you've been studying through this? How do you stumble upon them? Where's your go-to when you're studying Gospel of John?
That's awesome, man. Well, first off, man, I love what you're saying there with like the sandals, because it's true. But I love like in that story with Ruth too. My part of my understanding with the sandal kind of symbolism imagery as well was back then like the sandal was like your right to the land, right? And so when he's giving up, the Mr. So and so is kind of called in the thing, like is giving over to Boaz. Yeah, you inherit the farm, kind of the family
That's a
property,
good
like
point
the land
too.
and all that.
Yeah.
Like I'm giving up my right to tread the ground, kind of thing. My sandal's not going to be able to kind of go there anymore. I'm handing over my sandal to you in this kind of ceremony of the unsandaled, meant that now, like, dude, Boaz, the husband, the groom, he gets like the farm, the inheritance, the place.
Mm,
And so that's fascinating. I had not seen that connection before, but with John, I'm not worthy to untie his sandal. Like, dude, Jesus is the one. Is there something there with like the true son of the father who inherits the farm, like the promises, Israel, the land, like all the different stuff that's coming. Like John the Baptist is kind of the friend of the bridegroom who sees.
yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, it just feels like
No,
there's
that's.
so
I think it's a really
powerful.
good connection that you're picking up on, because there's like this land inheritance, the inbreaking of the kingdom, all of those sorts of languages that would also be extremely important. I didn't pick up on that, but should have. That's a consistent theme with levirate marriage laws. So it makes sense in Boaz's redemption that would take place. But you have the two stories. John the Baptist comes on the scene here, says, "Hey, not worthy to untie his sandal." Then you have a marriage ceremony, and then you have John right after the marriage ceremony saying, hey, the bridegroom, that's my joy is complete in his joy, right? Like I'm just happy
Yeah.
to be here and see him full of joy. And I go, it's hard to not see the wedding motif through all three texts, but the two chapters, I
Yeah.
suppose. Anyway, yeah, I'm just geeking
Well,
out with you. Sorry.
yeah, man. Well, to your question, dude, I love the patristics, man, like the early church fathers and all. And so back in seminary, I found myself doing a number of independent study projects, just reading through like Irenaeus and Athanasius and the Gregories, Gregory of Nyssa, the Cappadocian fathers, and other Maximus, the confessor. And so that's one stream where I found that stuff really inspiring. And one of the themes too is I often think the early church fathers can get a bad rap, because there can kind of be this like, and it's true, sometimes maybe they push it too far, but there can kind of be this like, oh, they're just allegorizing and reading too much into it. But what I found actually is like, dude, they're reading biblical threads at a deeper layer than we as contemporary readers are often seeing. So for example, I think of one that stood out to me years ago is like where one of the fathers talking about, oh, when Rahab and she puts out the red sign on
The Scarlet
the
Thread.
window, the
Yeah,
scarlet
yeah.
thread, to say like, oh, and some, you got some early church fathers who go, oh, it's a sign of the blood of Christ, and people going, oh, you're just reading into it, like that's just a thing. And so at face value you could say, oh yeah, it was just a red thread, they're just describing it historically. What in the world does that have to do with the blood of Christ? But if you start reading the Old Testament intertextually, what I do think you find then is you find that like that scarlet cord, scarlet thread language is tied to the Passover language from Exodus, of the blood over the doorpost for redemption when judgment comes. It's tied to Levitical language of a scarlet thread for redemption and some of the sacrificial stuff that takes place there. And once you start seeing that thread, you go, oh no, within the Old Testament itself, Rahab putting that scarlet cord out, once you're reading intertextually within the Old Testament, you go, no, it is a sign of being covered sacrificially by the blood of the atonement that's going to cover you when judgment comes. And that is a direct link to the blood of Christ, And so I think that like often I found that things like that showing up over and over again for me, where it's like, I'm not saying that the early church fathers, just like us today, they can't push things too far or misread, or we can't push back on stuff, but then they too quickly get dismissed by many contemporary folks because we're just looking at almost like we're looking at the passage in isolation, just kind of exegetically, what's happening in this immediate passage without looking at it intertextually and seeing the threads. That's some of what I'm trying to do in the Gospel of John in this newest book, is draw some of the Old Testament backdrops. Every chapter has an Old Testament backdrop that I think sheds light on what's happening in this famous scene in John, where the scene pops. It's kind of, you can just read it without knowing the Old Testament backdrop, and it's good and it's powerful and it's true. But when you get the Old Testament backdrop, it's like, it's just kind of blew up in Technicolor, like it's actually like really powerful. You can see it at whole other levels. And I'm sorry, you asked, when I'm reading, I'm kind of a scatterbrain. I love reading broadly. So for example, there's one chapter where I was heavily influenced by Robert Alter. He's a leading Jewish scholar, probably like the most prominent, teaches at Harvard on Jewish classics and all. And so in the chapter where I discussed John 4 and the woman at the well and how that's drawing on Old Testament marriage symbolism, Robert
I did the
Alter was
same
my
thing,
biggest
dude.
influence there.
No, I
Yeah,
did the
and
same
then
thing.
I also love reading.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think I pulled
Yep.
from Gospel Project, and they sourced a couple of
Yes.
scholars, and I was like, okay. And then I went and read those things, and super helpful. Yeah.
Yes, and quick to I read I remember reading a scholar, Brent Peter, and dude, he is a Catholic theologian, and he had some stuff on Gospel of John that influenced me tremendously in another area. And then there's a Reformed scholar named Alistair Roberts who highlighted my attention in John 8 and the woman caught in adultery and the links to Old Testament adultery law and some of the stuff there. And so I don't know, man, I'm kind of scatterbrain, hodgepodge all
I'm the
over the
same way.
place, and yeah.
No, I typically the way I do it is I'll I've got a subscription to a website called Everand, and for like $10 a month, you get access to their whole digital library, and that includes tons of commentaries. So as I was doing the book of Zechariah, I have Logos open and all my different commentaries on Logos, and they usually have some earlier church father stuff that you can pull from. But then on the other end, I've got all these other commentaries, and I would just find the ones that I really jive with. The first couple of weeks of preaching are always like miserable because you're trying to figure out which commentaries are all saying the exact same thing so that you can boot them and whittle them down to the one you prefer. But then
Yes.
like to get some of those early church guys in there, has been super helpful as I'm going through John in particular. Let's talk kind of where you start off on wedding of Cana stuff, because I think kind of that through line is some of the typological pictures there that we have in that reading. And I'm with you, by the way. I came up in a Pentecostal circle, and then kind of coming out of Pentecostalism, I probably had a cage stage, which is like the way that I was reading the text was like, we can't have any spiritual reading or typological reading because I had seen it so taken advantage of. But now, like, as I'm familiar, like, I can't have a chronological snobbery to say, like, I read the Bible correctly because I have a Western mind in this, like, post-Enlightenment era. But God has been speaking to his church through his spirit from generation to generation. And as you read a lot of the early church fathers, a lot of them have a similar style of reading. You can't say that they come to the same conclusions on things, but they have they all seem to lean into a typological kind of reading. How does this point to Christ? And in a movement that really esteems highly the Christ-centered preaching, I go, well, that's actually something I can get behind. So as long as it's not spiritually pointing, I think oftentimes to us, it's like some kind of narcissism. I find that it's actually really fruitful, the typology to point to Christ. Talk about marriage supper, or not marriage supper. That's maybe a Freudian slip there. The wedding of Cana. Talk to us about how you view this as a resurrection wedding. I think that's a really interesting connection there.
Totally, man. So Jesus' first sign in John chapter 2, it's we're told it happens on the third day in Cana. And right at the beginning, dude, you're kind of going, okay, third day of what, John? Is it the third day of the year, like January 3rd, or is it the third day of the week, like is it Tuesday? Or what are you saying third day? He doesn't say, but it's actually, I show throughout in a lot of the chapters, John gives us these little literary markers that are a clue into the meaning of the scene that's about to follow. So what else happens on a third day? Resurrection, right? So it's John's kind of way of going like, dude, you're about to see a resurrection scene. What you find is throughout John's gospel, wherever he has that third day marker, what follows is a resurrection scene. Wherever he has a Passover marker, it was around the time of Passover, you're about to see a crucifixion motif, right? So we're told on the third day in Cana, this wedding. And Jesus makes a ton of wine, right? This is his first sign. He makes around 150 gallons. It's like a boatload of wine. And it's a party that's already going. Weddings back then were about a week long, and the party's already been going for days. So why in the world, Jesus, are you making all this wine, right? Jesus is not the dude who shows up to the party with like a bag of Doritos and some leftover KFC, right? He's bringing the best stuff to the party. What is going on here, though? Why so much wine, Jesus? Well, it's helpful here when you get some of the Old Testament backdrop again, because the Old Testament prophets said that when the Messiah comes, he is going to bring this abundance of wine. It was a picture of restoration and abundance. So the prophets like Amos and Joel, for example, listen to this prophecy from Amos. He says this. He says, when the Messiah comes, he says, the mountains shall drip sweet wine, and all the hills shall flow with it. Cash it. You're like, mountains are dripping, hills are flowing, rivers are running with wine. He goes on and says, very next verse, I'll restore the fortunes of my people Israel. They shall rebuild the ruined cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink their wine. They shall make gardens and eat their fruit. And what you start to see is like these passages are about more than just wine. They're about God restoring his people's fortunes. They're about him returning them to the land, like rebuilding their cities, return from exile. This day, Jesus is saying, his sign, this day has arrived in Jesus. So Jesus' first sign, it is not just like a party trick. Like, look how powerful Jesus is. He's able to turn much water and wine, right? Like sometimes I think we can read it that way if we just kind of go quickly. Like it's like, oh, wow, look, Jesus is powerful. But it's not that Jesus is just doing something to prove he's powerful, whatever. No, it's something much bigger than that. It's a sign that's pointing to the destination he has come to bring us to, which is a resurrection wedding of restoration and abundance, right? So talk about in the chapter kind of the imagery of what is Jesus doing here. His first miracle, he is setting the GPS coordinates for where his ministry is headed. Like he's going, I've come to bring about a resurrection wedding that's going to bring abundance where the hills flow with wine, the mountains drip with it. And Mary kind of, Mary approaches him and like, hey, Jesus, they ran out of wine, trouble, and Jesus' response is, my time has not yet come. What's he saying? Well, the way I read what he's saying there is going, it's not time yet for my death and resurrection, where my glory is going to be revealed. But AKA like subtext here is, but I'm going to give you a sign that points to where my glory will be revealed, right? Which
So good.
is my death and resurrection, which brings about this resurrection wedding and a restoration of abundance and all.
Yeah, no, I love that. I preach this to my church frequently. They're probably tired of me hearing it because of how often I do communion. But like the taste of the future age, like the manna in the wilderness, it tasted like honey, and they're going into a land flowing with milk and honey. So this is like a right now taste of the future resurrection, that future life that we come into at that resurrection. So I love the picture there. What are your thoughts on like the tie to Moses and like Moses turning water into blood, Christ turning water into wine, and the kind of parallelism there? You mentioned your book, Washed in the Blood, but I'll just kind of lob that thought over to you for response.
Yes, totally, man. That's great, dude. You bring up the Moses because I do think you got that Moses echo of judgment, and Christ is going to bear that judgment, right? I hadn't thought of that one. Yeah, that potential link. I want to reflect on that because that was powerful. What I do think is very clear, kind of the argument I make in that chapter, an allusion that is there, is that, like you said, you used to get washed with water, now you get washed with wine. Now, what do I mean by that? John tells us that the water Jesus is using for this miracle is in 6 purification jars that were used for the rites of Jewish purification. So Jesus is intentional. Everything he's doing, right, in this miracle, these jars were used for the Old Testament rites of purification, basically dealing with uncleanliness, impurity, pollution, stain, all that kind of stuff. And so Jesus is using basically what I see happening here is it's a picture. You used to get washed with water, these 6 jars, but now Jesus has come and you get washed with wine, the blood of the covenant that Jesus spills. Because what's fascinating is at the end of later in John's gospel, when Jesus is crucified, he dies and the spear pierces his side. And John then tells us what came out of Jesus' side: water and blood, right? Like water and blood. And he makes note of this. Jesus is the 7th vessel. In other words, in John's gospel,
So
you have
good.
these 6 vessels from the Old Testament representing the Old Testament covenant of purification with water and whatnot. That was just, but now Jesus is the 7th vessel whose side is pierced. And now Jesus, in his own life, his body, his death, Jesus turns water into wine. And that wine, the blood of the wine of his blood shed, is the means by which we have purification from sin, which we see later in John's other letters. We see in the New Testament as a whole, like we're washed by the blood of the Lamb that cleanses and purifies us from all unrighteousness. You used to get washed with water, now you get washed with wine. It's just a little detail in John's gospel, but once you start seeing everything that John gives us, every detail is intentional. It starts to, whoa, like he's given us almost like a stained glass window or an iconic picture or something that's like, that little detail actually represents something powerful about who Christ is and what he's done. He's the 7th vessel who's turned water to wine and now offers that for our purification from sin.
Dang, I wish I had read this and had this conversation before that sermon, because, my intro to John's sermon, which was, I think, 2 weeks, I like leaned into the idea that John makes all these pairs of 7 everywhere he goes. That was a pretty important pair of 7 that I missed out on. I caught the Moses reference, depending on how you're counting the signs. Carmen Imes, who is just a hero of mine, I think she comes on next week. I love her. But I got to sit in her ETS lecture on Exodus. The way that she counts those Exodus signs are different than what have been typically counted as like, the certain, instead of like, hey, there's 9 plagues, and there is, in her mind though, she goes, only a few of them are called plagues. Most of them are called signs. And she starts with the counting with the serpent before Pharaoh. The serpent swallows up the other serpent. But then she ends the parallel when they're crossing over, on dry ground. And here comes Pharaoh, likely dressed in military attire, wearing a serpent-like headdress, coming out onto the battlefield, and the waters swallowing him up like a serpent. So here's the picture, bookend on both sides, of a serpent swallowing a serpent. And I'm just like, dude, where have you been? This is insane. Like, I don't know how you picked up on that, but that, like, the imagery is really solid. So
Totally.
I'm over here going, Moses' first sign, is turning water into blood, and here's Jesus' first sign turning water into wine. But then I'm over going, oh, well, it depends on how you count them. So it's one of those how do you count the commandments sort of situation, but it's really
Dude,
cool parallels.
well, is it okay if we go on a little
Oh,
tangent with
please. Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
Moses and the serpent?
I'm bringing up nonsense. Go ahead.
No, it's not nonsense at all. It's awesome. This is actually something that I highlight in an earlier book, Beautiful Union. I think I put it in more of a footnote, but like an observation that hit me years ago where I was kind of studying on, some people struggle with like the hardening of Pharaoh's heart and what's going on with, man, that seems cruel. Why is God hardening his heart? Like he's got, but what's fascinating, what really helps, I think, is when you start seeing the words that are used for the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. There's three different words that gets used in different passages, three different Hebrew words, and they all get English hardened, but three different kind of associations, and they all show up earlier in the Exodus narrative. And that is one of the, and I think once you get the narrative backdrop, it starts to make more sense of what's going on with the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, right? So, the first one, if I remember right, is that scene that you mentioned where Moses is getting chased by the snake, and then God tells him, "Hey, turn around and harden your grip around it," basically, and it hardened in his hand. And it's this kind of narrative picture of like, dude, Pharaoh's going to be running after you, but I'm going to harden in a sense, like I'm gonna narratively, he's going to be coming after you at the Red Sea, but I'm going to harden him, like as a sense of like, dude, he's gonna. It's been a while since I've looked at it, but like there's associations of what's going to happen there with Pharaoh getting swallowed in the Red Sea, essentially, And a second one is where Pharaoh is making life hard for the Israelites by now you got to make bricks without straw. And so Pharaoh is being heavy, hardened, oppressive upon the Israelites. But now God's like, hey, you've been hard, heavy on my firstborn son, so I'm gonna get hard, heavy on you. I think like to deal with that. And then the third association is a word that has to do with childbirth. And the place that it shows earlier is when Rachel dies in childbirth. So she dies giving birth to her youngest son, to Benjamin. And she had these fierce, heavy, hardened labor pangs, and then she dies. And I go into a larger kind of argument in that note, but basically I think you have similar imagery in the Exodus where now Egypt is depicted as like in the travail of birth, like the plagues are almost like labor pangs, of let my people go, unwilling to let the Son of God go and emerge, but God's bringing down like inducing forced labor in a sense, and through this painful birth, Pharaoh and Egypt, like Rachel, die giving birth to God's firstborn son, as they go under judgment that leads to the death of their firstborn son and what. So all that to say, man, that probably needs more discussion at some level, and I can't remember it all offhand, but just going like you're pointing to, we're talking about John drawing on the Old Testament. Then you go back into the Old Testament and you see these intertextual layers of how different passages and language are echoing earlier passages and stories. Yes. Where when you start seeing those, it's like, whoa, things start popping from fresh new angles.
No, I love that. And that's, again, man, I really want to the best of my ability, bring out of the old and bring out of the new, as it were. Like I want to make sure that I'm preaching and teaching something that is consistent with what the church has seen in the scripture, right? So like that's one of the reasons I need to read really well. But at that same time, like I think we've read the passage of Jesus cleansing the temple, or the wedding of Cana. And oftentimes we just like, cool, Jesus made a bunch of wine, like a frat party. That's awesome. Look, and then the application point is like, God will, he'll put up with your silly requests, and he's able to do exceedingly abundantly more than you can ask or think, and we just kind of check it off there. And I think sometimes we often run to like the application and we rob the text of like the literary beauty at times that like glorifies, oh, look how cool, you mentioned it a second ago. but it's the difference between watching the story in black and white and like
Mm.
4K surround sound immersive, what's that big dome in Vegas? They got
Oh yeah,
the whatever,
totally.
it's like
I
it's
can't
an
I can't remember
immersive
what it's called, but
experience.
totally.
But yeah, it's an
Yeah.
immersive experience. And all I'm saying is that that the text is beautiful. You could read the text at face value, like figure out life application and move on. But I think that you kind of rob yourself of all the beauty and the glory and the splendor that Christ has presented with us in the text. So I love this, and I'm happy to chase as many rabbits with you as possible as we, from the old to the new, because that's the fun of this. And I think that people who are good students of the word, they want to just kind of drill down into all of the kind of nitty and gritty, because it beautifies Christ
Mm.
and his message.
Wow.
I'm in.
Can
Go
I
ahead. Yeah, please,
piggyback on
please.
that one more
Yeah,
thing
yeah.
too? Just maybe a final thing on the wedding at Cana miracle. Is because it speaks to a way of reading John, right? Some have called it like a mystagogical reading, where it's like it's not reading into it. It's actually going. I want to argue it's with John's intention, like as an author, what he's intending us. But just give an example here. Each of the signs, I argue, is what is it a sign of? It's a sign of the gospel, like a sign of the death and resurrection of Jesus. So if you look at the ending of the miracle at Cana, right, turning of water to wine, what happens at the end of the scene? Well, you have the master of the banquet, the wine is brought to you. He tastes it and he goes, "Oh my gosh, this is better than everything that's come before. You've saved the best for last," he declares to the groom. And so you got the groom and the bride, the master of the banquet tasting the wine, delighting in this thing. And once you get kind of the imagery that we've been unpacking here, like, dude, what is the Gospel of John giving us here? That's a picture of the gospel, dude. Like, what is it? Like,
That's
the
right.
Father tasting of, delighting in the sacrificial love of his Son, the groom, poured out for the church as his bride, that brings forth this resurrection wedding where the hills are going to run with wine, like it's restoration, new creation, abundance, and all. The ending scene of the wedding at Cana, it's the gospel. It's like a
That's
picture.
right.
It's an iconic window picture image of the gospel, the Son's sacrificial love, the delight of the Father over his Son, the delight in the bride, the groom and the bride coming together in this restoration, abundance, and so forth. And so, what I would want to argue is like what John is doing here. It's way more than a history lesson. Oh, hey, look, Jesus did this cool thing back in the day. No, he's going like, dude, this is a picture of the gospel, and all seven signs are this. I would argue, and when you get that, a few observations. One is, oh my gosh, dude, Jesus is so awesome. Because it's not like Jesus is like, oh, I didn't think about that, John. Wow, wait a minute. It's like, no, Jesus is intentional. Like, he's doing it on the third day. He's getting the 6 jars. Like, I mean, like, Jesus is intentional with the details. He's orchestrating these signs to be a picture of these bigger realities, more than anyone knows in the moment as they're experiencing it, right? And I think it's later as John, as the disciples, are reflecting and going, whoa, check this out. Like, just layers of reflecting and meditating upon what Christ has done and who he is, that these light bulbs are turning on, I imagine, over time for John. So A is going like, whoa, Jesus is so amazing. B, I think this is interesting theologically, that John has parables. Like, it's often said, people will say, hey, the synoptics, Jesus does parables, but John famously kind of doesn't have parables. And at one layer, that's true. Like, what's meant by that is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is saying, hey, the kingdom of God is like a da da da. And he gives a parable, a story about the thing. And Jesus is telling stories as pictures of the kingdom. But what I want to suggest is, like, it's not that John doesn't have parables, it's that John has living parables. His are
That's
not
right.
just Jesus telling a story about it. His is painting a picture, like painting the picture of what Jesus did and going, that's the story of it. The master of the banquet delighting in the sacrificial love of or the wine of the Son and the union with the bride, and everything's happening like that. That's a living parable of the gospel. And he's
That's
doing
right.
that all throughout the gospel.
No, I think, and that's so good. And one more thing. You know, the connection with the Moses. The reason I think that's important is that, to your point, in this picture, the blood is judgment, turning the water into blood. And you go back to John 1, he's going to say, the law came through Moses, but grace and truth by Jesus Christ. Right? Like this idea that Christ comes and there's this grace. And so you have a pattern, a parallel where, you know, Jesus is telling Nicodemus, you know, Moses is going to condemn you. The law is going to condemn you. He tells John 5, the Pharisees that are present, right? Like, hey, if you don't accept my word, right? If you don't accept the truth that I've come to bear witness, he says Moses is bearing witness against you. Like I've not come, I will come to judge, but not in the same sense. Like Moses is what is going to be standing against you on Judgment Day. But that consistent parallel through John, and then you come into this wedding scenario, the law is what will condemn us on the day of judgment. And yet here Christ says, I'm going to use this moment of judgment as celebration for those who are in Christ. So like in one sense, everyone's getting washed in blood. Right. If you take that parallel, there's a blood of Moses, right? There's like this judgment motif, or there's this washed in the blood of Christ. And again, you see that kind of parable like comparison on both sides of this, that John is speaking in parable, to your point, not in a strict wooden literal sense of a parable. Okay, now that we've done 30 minutes
Totally,
on one story.
Oh man, well, dude,
This is
and
totally
we
worth
can
the
go.
price of admission. Yeah, we'll just hang out on the wedding Cana for this podcast. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna say we can go wherever you want, but even those themes that you're getting heading to of like law and grace, I feel like John 5 is all about that.
Yes,
You know,
sir.
like that's so fascinating. The guy who's been paralyzed for 38 years.
Yep.
At least I argue in that chapter that like that as well as a picture of. I don't know if you want to go there or anywhere else, but
Yeah, go
that's
for
really
it. Go
interesting.
for it.
Yeah. Okay. So John 5, Jesus famously he raises a man who's been paralyzed for 38 years, who wants to get up and go into the water where the healing supposedly is found, but he can't, and no one will help him. He says, "Well, you know," so what's going on here? Well, again, Old Testament echoes. I think it's worth asking, is there anywhere else that number 38 appears in the Bible? And there is. There's actually a pretty important place. There's actually one other place that number 38 appears in the Old Testament. It's Deuteronomy 2, verse 14 tells us that 38 years passed between the Israelites being camped at Mount Sinai, and it's basically they're wandering in the wilderness. So we often think of it as 40
Dang.
years, where they came out of Egypt and then they entered the Promised Land. It's 40 years, but actually what happens is the first 2 years they go to Mount Sinai, they get the law, and you have the golden calf incident, the rebellion at Sinai, and then they end up because of their rebellion, their hard-heartedness, their sin, under the weight and the curse of the law, they wander in the wilderness for 38 years. Now, here's what's fascinating. A lot of early church commentators observed, they saw that this man, paralyzed for 38 years, was a picture of Israel stuck in the wilderness under the weight of the law,
Unable to
rise up
enter
into
in.
the promise. Totally.
Yeah.
So this is I've got a quote here from I think I have it here, where William Barclay, kind of a famous commentator on the Gospel of John. Okay, is that it? Oh man, I'm sorry, my computer's freezing up. I was trying to pull up the quote. I can't find it. Okay, well, basically, the quote where he's going in is that the man, for a lot of the early church fathers, represented Israel stuck in the wilderness. There are these 5 porches in the scene, and early church commentators often saw those as representing like the 5 books of the law that, like the law, exposed the people's sin. It provided some measure of shelter, but it could not heal them. That the waters, kind of like the waters of the Jordan, like the people were unable to rise up and enter through the waters of the Jordan and enter into the promised land. And 38 years, the 38 years waiting to enter the promised land, and some also looked at it as like the 38 centuries in between then the giving of the law and the waiting for the Messiah, when Jesus would come. And I see that and go, whoa, dude, that's amazing. That's awesome. You know, like that picture. But I know some people, this is one of those places where I think people can go like, well, there goes those early church fathers reading into it. But I actually would argue that this is John's intention. Like John is
Yeah, how
pretty
many times
clearly
does he
actually,
say this guy's blind, or
yeah,
this guy, like they don't give details. So many times in the Gospels, they're like, person was lame, person was deaf. Like why add to the number? And I think that you have to ask those
yes,
kinds of questions when you're reading. Why say 6 water jars? Like maybe it's just a
yeah,
historical moment, but like oftentimes they just say water jars, right? Like that would be as appropriate. So you read a novel, I forget who I was reading that was talking about this, but like you read a good novel and, the guy's in there cleaning his shotgun, there's a knock at the door and he places it, pulls the clip, the shells out of the shotgun and places it on top of the armoire where no one can see it. And then you think to yourself, oh, he's going to need that later. Like you read fiction thinking, oh, that's going to be important for later. But oftentimes we read the
yes,
scriptures just going, oh, they're giving us historical facts about things. It's
yes,
true. Like I do think the guy was lame
yeah,
for 38 years, but again, God is sovereign, and he
yeah,
found himself meeting this man who had this issue for 38 years, and John thought it was important to include it. And I think that we need to be
yes, and
reading things like that.
totally. And big picture too, I kind of go, dude, why does Jesus choose the dude who's been there 38 years? Like you got a lot of people here in the scene, and like that's who he goes for. Jesus is orchestrating this scene, and a few other thoughts on what this means for this passage. Well, or maybe first to kind of reinforce like why I think this is intentional for John is this whole section of John's gospel is all about the backdrop is Israel's wilderness wanderings. So earlier structure of John. You've got John 1 as his intro. John 2 to 4 is one section where it starts with a third day in Cana and then it ends with a third day in Cana resurrection scene. So that's kind of the bookends where John, it's kind of his literary clue. Okay, here's one section, John 2 to 4. Very next thing after that section is he says, at the sheep gate, Jesus enters into the temple and heals this dude for 38 years at the sheep gate. Well, that next bookend comes in John 10, where he says, I am the gate for the sheep. And so you've got this section of John 5 to 10 is recognized as kind of a literary section of John. And the backdrop throughout the section is Israel's wilderness wanderings. So the chapters that come after John 5 here are about God's provision of manna in the wilderness in John 6, like the heavenly bread,
Yep,
God's
yep.
provision of water in the wilderness in John 7, God's guiding light in the wilderness, John 8, and 9, like the golden calf incident, Israel's adultery in the wilderness, John 8, God shepherding his people in the wilderness, John 10. So this whole section, John is setting up this whole section, I think, in terms of his chronology. John is famously not ordering things chronologically, but theologically. Like his ordering of the events, scholars recognize this different order than the other gospels, where John's actually he's communicating a theological meaning in the order he's doing it. So all that to say, man, I think it's powerful to recognize John, I believe, wants us to see this man paralyzed for 38 years as a picture of Israel and of us under the curse of the law. And in my own story, how does this relate pastorally, dude? Like, I found myself in this season of life after a really brutal season where I found myself kind of going, was I wrong or was I wronged? Where I was wrestling for about a year, well, especially 6 months, of just kind of like waking up in the middle of the night, 3 a.m., and just some stuff that had gone down where I'm like, oh my gosh, was I wrong? Was I wrong? Like I couldn't sleep. I was, dude, that season I mentioned with like some suicidal thoughts, with tremors breaking out, my hand tremoring, like all this kind of stuff. And so for really about a year, dude, I felt stuck. Like it was hard for me to rise up and re-enter life as normal. And the conviction, I felt like this man on the mat, like unable to get up and re-enter into life and the promises again. And like this scene, what I found God eventually convicted me of is like, hey, Josh, you're analyze yourself under the categories of law, not under the categories of grace, right? Like, was I wrong? Did I do something wrong? Broke the law, broke your rule or something, dude, and now I'm getting punished for it? Or was I wrong? Someone else did. And, but and the reality is probably there was a mix of both in my situation, but there's stuff I could have done better and there's stuff that you know, uh, people could have done better, right? It's probably a mix of that. But my whole framework was the law, I like implicitly was, even though I wasn't thinking about it that way. And I experienced Jesus approaching me and extending the hand and going, Josh, do you want to get well? Like, are you going to sit there and evaluate yourself forever under the categories of law? Or are you going to live what you believe and rely on my grace to lift you up and rise you up? Like, that it's not dependent on you being good enough, smart enough, wise enough, kind of whatever, like it's actually you're a child of God because of grace, and the promises are yours,
Amen.
not because that, but because of grace, and so I found like, man, this whole scene of John chapter 5, I saw myself in that man stuck on the mat, unable to get up and like under the weight of the law and just, I can't do it. And then Jesus comes and says, hey, do you want to get well? Because the question is not, are you good enough to get in my kingdom? It's, will you let me heal you?
Mm-hmm.
That's what grace does.
Okay, dude, I love this. I want to camp out on this. But we're at 4:44, so I got 15 minutes ish. I think that connection of was I wrong or was I wronged really works well if we backpedal into chapter 4 with the woman at the well.
Oh,
So I
great.
think let's hang out in that theme for a little bit, because in this scene I grew up hearing the woman at the well was a flusy, right? I snuck that word into my sermon from Nacho Libre, but she's a flusy, right? And that's
I
she's
love
just getting
Nacho
her.
Libre.
Who doesn't, you gotta laugh. So
Did you tell him they
you
were
know
the Lord's cheaps? Yes,
that's
yes.
right. I worked that one into the feeding of the 5,000. I didn't, but I should have. In this context, you have this lady. She's been married 5 times, but now she's not. And I kind of took a real broad approach to it, because you have a couple of options. One, she was unfaithful, and that's why she's been married 5 times. I think it's the less likely of the actual interpretations. I think you pick up on this as well. Option two is like law of Moses. She was given a certificate of divorce that had to be given by a male counterpart, right? And then I had that option three, which I hadn't really considered until I started preaching the text. This could be a levirate marriage situation. She could have married a guy who died, and married a guy who died, and married a guy who died, and like she's a widower. Like also a live option in the first century, folks died unnecessarily, for lots of different things. Anyway, so I'm like, okay, this lady's got some options here, and I preached it to the context of saying, again, I don't think that she was unfaithful is the most likely of the scenarios, but let's just put these 3 scenarios out there and go, can you see yourself in the text? Can you see yourself in the
Mm.
text as someone who's been taken advantage of by others? Can you see yourself in the text as someone who has violated God's law and now are in need of grace? Can you see yourself in the text as death and destruction comes knocking at the door and is taken advantage, right? Like, whether you're grieving, whether you've been wronged, or whether you are the wrongdoer, here comes Christ in the midst of that. And maybe John's vague on purpose, but so here, that was my little preaching point there. But I'm going to toss it back over to you, because
Excellent.
you've got all kinds of good stuff. I spent 4 weeks
Oh, man.
on the woman at the well, because I just think there's a lot to draw out of that well. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, totally, man. That's awesome. Well, yeah, man. So, dude, I love the story. And actually, so one thing you mentioned the levirate marriage kind of possibility or option. One thing I didn't put in the book just because of space, because it just wasn't enough of space. But a thought I hypothetically had kind of been curious of is I've become more and more convinced that John is relying on and interacting with the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptics, right? And I've wondered if a potential allusion or echo here is you got the famous where Jesus's interlocutors come up and they're like, "Hey, let's say there's a woman who
That's right.
husband one dies, husband two dies, husband three dies, husband four dies. Like all these husbands die. Whose husband will she be in the resurrection? And
Yep.
if
Yep.
this is almost John's version of that thing, where I argue at the end of the day, she's had these five, now six, who's not her husband. Jesus is the seventh husband in this picture. Like he's the dude.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm jumping ahead of myself. I've wondered if that's there. So let's jump back. So big picture, what I see going on here, Old Testament allusion. So starting, I got this from Robert Alter, who I mentioned earlier, the Jewish scholar, but the well, the location where this encounters, that might just seem like a passing detail, but again, every detail in John is significant. And in the Old Testament, the well was a very significant location. It was where the groom first met his bride. So you've got Isaac's bride, Rebecca, was discovered at a well in Genesis 24. You've got Jacob. He first locks eyes with Rachel the love of his life at a well in Genesis 29. And then Moses rescued Zipporah at a well, leading to their betrothal in Exodus 2. And so Alter observes how the well is like a marital type scene. It's like a betrothal type scene. And he outlines these 5 different characteristics in stories like these and elsewhere that are common to this betrothal type scene. And what's crazy is you see all 5 of these in John chapter 4 with Jesus, right? So these are Alter's things. Number 1 is that the future groom journeys to a foreign land. That's what happens with Jesus here in John 4. He's going to a foreign land. Number 2, there he encounters a girl at a well. Happens with Jesus. Number 3, one of them draws water from the well. You got this whole extended discussion of Jesus and the woman about the water of life and all. Number 4, the girl rushes home with news of the stranger's arrival, which happens here. She goes into town, tells everyone about Jesus. And number 5, a betrothal is concluded after he's been invited to a meal. Where we got this discussion after of Jesus going, I have food to eat you know not of, and he's invited to stay with the town and have this be with the Samaritans for a number of days. Okay, so all that to go, I believe John is narrating, he's highlighting details and emphasizing things that depict this as a picture of Christ encountering his church.
100%.
Now, what I'm not saying is that there's something literally romantic going on between Jesus and this woman, right?
Agreed.
On a horizontal level, right? But
Right,
on a
right.
vertical level, it's a picture of, dude, Christ encountering his church, right? And that's intentional on John's part. Okay, so you asked a great question. Now, in this picture, does the woman represent a sinner, like someone who's done wrong, or like who's, man, she, like you said, kind of the floozy, right? Sometimes she's gotten interpreted as that, or is she represented as kind of a tragic figure who's a victim, like had all these horrible things done to her or happened to her, right? Now I want to suggest that it's both, and kind of for different reasons, right? So on a historic immediate level of Jesus literally encountering this woman in their conversation, right? I think actually, like you were saying, I think it's more of the latter, that she's like a tragic figure. Because if you think historically, it's it would have been very unlikely that she's like getting married and ditching her husband, going like the male had the power dynamic with men versus women in marriage. That seems like an unlikely scenario. I think for ancient readers hearing this, their likely thing would not have been, oh man, she's so promiscuous. Or I think their likely thing would have been, whoa, she's had a really hard life. She's had that many husbands reject her or die, or tragic things happen to her, so on that level, I think there's a picture here of her as whether a victim of husbands who've been mistreated her and discarded her and rejected her, or a tragic figure who's had husbands die, and the vulnerability that she would have had then in the ancient world. Now the sixth one won't even marry her. But on another level, I think that the Samaritan woman represents something symbolically. I think she's actually a representative for Samaria and the people of Samaria as a whole. Because what's fascinating, okay, she had 5 husbands. I think that's symbolic, right? You go, I mean, literally she had them, but I think it's representing something. You go back to Samaria in the Old Testament, and you can find this in 2 Kings chapter 17. What's crazy is what happened to Samaria is Samaria was the northern kingdom of Israel. It got conquered by Assyria. And what they did was they brought their idolatry with them. And so 2 Kings 17, verses 24 to 41, it talks about these 5 cities, basically like, this is again early church commentary. They saw the woman's 5 husbands as symbolizing these 5 cities that Samaria had, quote unquote, intermarried with, literally intermarried with, and whose foreign religious practices Samaria had integrated. And so the prophets of the Old Testament are regularly depicting the people of God as a spouse running after many lovers. And Samaria in particular had cheated on God with the pagan empire, and had married or intermarried with and taken on the idols. There were 5 male idols, 5 male deities or gods of these nations that intermarried with. So this woman with 5 husbands in her past is a perfect representative for her people, Samaria, who had these 5 idolatrous other gods that they had through intermarriage adopted and united themselves with. And now who's the sixth husband that she's not actually married to? Some saw this too as like the picture of now she's kind of gone away from those and kind of towards Yahweh, but not fully, because she hasn't really entered the covenant again. Like she's the Samaritans had religious practices that were outside of faithfulness. And basically, I feel like I got a little
No, you're good. You're good.
there. What am I trying to say? Or go ahead.
Yeah. This was something that I had a hard time with in my commentaries, because I read the early church stuff. They were like, Samaritans, they're false gods. And some of my more modern commentaries were like, well, if you read into it, depending on how you count, archaeologically, there could be 7 to 14 gods, so they're like, I don't know, maybe not. And I kind of, disregarded. But I think to your point, what I think is really interesting, and maybe one of the reasons I should have maybe treated this more sincerely, is that it's actually recorded in the scriptures, right? Like this is a hyperlink to scripture, not necessarily a hyperlink to the archaeological, so like if you talk about Babylon, you'd be like, oh, the gods of Babylon. Well, Yahweh typically brings up like Baal and Asherah. Like those are the ones that he brings up. Now, did Babylon have other gods? Certainly they did. But it's not to say that by mentioning those two that there weren't the others, but the scriptures will reference the two, right? Quite frequently. So I think that's an interesting connection there. The idea that she is representative of Samaria. I'm warming up to the idea, possibly. And again, this one isn't new for me, but it is one that I'm kind of wrestling through, kind of live on the spot. But in the same the typological way that we're like, hey, this guy had this issue for 38 years. Here she is representative of someone who looks like Samaria in a lot of ways. And Jesus comes on the scene, to your point, to correct her poor theology. That's not why he came, but he does it. Oh, hey, we worship here, you guys say to worship there, and he's like, well, you're definitely wrong about this. Salvation is under the Jews. Like he's correcting her bad theology in the midst of that. But I can see how there could be a patterning here. And even if you go, hey, 7, well, you have Christ representing the other 7, right? Which is an interesting parallel. I think that's fun.
Dude, can I throw one more factor in to consider this? Because I do think, like you said, man, she's like, hey, you say this mountain, we say this mountain. Jesus is like, well, hey, the time is coming and has now come. Essentially going, I'm here, and now true worship is going to change. Like now you can actually be united to your true husband, Christ, the 7th husband, where she can really enter the covenant that she's not currently in with her kind of sixth thing, right? But here's the one other piece I've thrown into the mix that the structure, how this story, Jesus and the woman at the well, fits into the structure of the section of John. I talk about this at the end of the book, and it was too convoluted to try and get into it in this chapter. But what I argue is, John 2-4 is a section. Like biblical scholars see that. It starts the third day at wedding at Cana, ends with the third day at Cana, and both are resurrection scenes. And then you work your way, it's like chiasm, you work your way in up towards the middle, where you've got temple with the temple destruction, Jesus saying, destroy this temple, and the Nicodemus conversation of representative temple leadership. It climaxes at like a scene that's like kind of basically like the cross, crucifixion. So from that point, kind of the pinnacle of the chiasm, if you will, in John 2-4, you're working your way back down the chiasm, back down the mountain, so to speak. And guess where it starts? In Jerusalem, Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus, the temple leadership. It then moves to Judea with John the Baptist, and
that's right. I made the same connection. Yeah.
And then it moves to Samaria, with the Samaritan woman, whole deal.
Yep.
And then it moves to the ends of the earth, in Galilee of the Gentiles, and the Roman centurion, Gentile official whose son gets healed. And what is John doing? Well, his structure here, what is he theologically communicating with his ordering of events? That the gospel from the cross, Jesus' death and resurrection, it's going to go from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the ends of the earth. It's basically his literary way of talking about the Great Commission. Jesus, you guys set us up as you're going to bring the gospel from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria, the ends of the earth. So what does that have to do with what we were talking about a second ago? as Jesus has this encounter with the Samaritan woman, I think that it's more than his encounter with her as an individual. She is a representative for his encounter with Samaria, like restoring the northern kingdom of Israel through his death and resurrection, of them being invited into, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile, into union with Christ and restoration in the covenant. And part of that means her 5 husbands of the idolatrous gods from 2 Kings 17 are being done away with, and her weird, shady relationship with Yahweh and the 6th husband who's not a husband, like now she's able to be united with the 7th husband, who is he's restoring Samaria's calling to be brought back into the covenant
I want to look
through
at that chiastic structure again, because now because if okay, like now I'm like unwillfully seeing things that I'm like on air, not on air because we're not live, but like this is going to go out, so everyone double check and read some stuff. And I'm not trying to teach on the fly here, but now I'm curious, because if that chiastic structure is the case, is she the representative to the Samaritans like John the Baptist is the representative to the Jews? Because
Yes.
you have that kind of parallelism there. And I've actually called her the John the Baptist of Samaria over and over. But what's interesting about that is that the Jews don't receive Jesus through the work of John, but you have that bridegroom motif that's still there, because I can't unsee it now. Clearly, with the woman at the well, Jesus comes to her, water, is drawn up spiritually, not physically. She runs off to tell her family, not her literal family, but the town of Samaria. They come out, and here is a wedding ceremony that's kind of struck. And again, spiritually, because they believe in Christ. So they're united to him. And then you have that flip side. So you have that marriage imagery there. And then you have John the Baptist over here with that foot sandal, conversation. Like, I wonder if there's even more hyperlinks that are going on that I haven't picked up on.
Yes.
God, that's so
Totally.
frustrating.
No.
It's so frustrating when you preach a book of the Bible and you're like, I spent so much work on this and I've had an hour-long conversation and there's 13 things I missed. But it's also exciting. It's a fun part of the Bible. You can read it and
Well,
not see
dude,
stuff.
and to your point, I think that like right before, when in Judea, when John the Baptist, he right leading into the Samaritan woman at the well, John the Baptist says, "I'm not the groom, I'm the friend of the bridegroom." And I think it's John's kind of way too. There's a kind of allusion to like, um, dude, I'm not the groom, but here he comes. Like he's setting the stage
Totally.
for this encounter of the groom and bride scene that's coming. And then what's interesting too is, dude, I think the woman at the well, she is such a fascinating representative for the church, in that, okay, she's got this difficult past, whether it's tragic or sinner or whatever, like the church, like we're both sinner and sinned against. We got all the mess in us, but also like she's part Jew, part Gentile, right? What were the Samaritans? They were the intermingling kind of Jewish and Gentile, both identity and practices. And that's a major New Testament theme, is that the church is first to the Jew, then to the
That's right.
Gentile, but it's the bringing into the Gentiles, the ingathering into the people of God. And that Jesus journeys to her from a distant land. He crosses all these barriers and obstacles to get to his bride. And ultimately, not just from Jerusalem to Samaria, Jesus crosses from heaven to earth to get to his bride. And so you've got this picture of Jesus, the boundary breaker, overcoming every obstacle to get to the woman at the well. And she's part Jew, part Gentile, and she's got a past that's both probably representative of something both tragic and stuff she's done. And dude, that's just, you couldn't come up with a better picture for the church as the bride of Christ,
So good. So, okay, we're at an hour. I've got as much as like, hey, we've talked about 3 different passages. Maybe we've talked about 1,000, depends on how you count. Man, that was a ton of fun. Thank you for jumping on. That was a genuine pleasure. Maybe one of my more fun podcasts I've had in the last couple of months. So thanks for nerding out with me. I've really enjoyed having you on, man. I tell my church when I preach, I
really
give
quick
them
too,
go ahead.
Oh, and I was saying really quick too to what you said about like finishing something and then being like preaching a sermon and then, oh, I wish I'd seen this. No, even the month that the book released, like it was like a week or two later, and someone pointed out some stuff I saw, or there was some new stuff on the restoration of Peter in John 21. I'm like, oh, that would have been perfect in the book, and I missed it. It's like, dude, I wish I could go back and add that in. But
Happens
man,
all the time.
That's real all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, and I do this when I preach. I give like probably 4 to 7 pages of like notes. Like I turn my sermon notes into like a handout in paragraph form for people, and they can kind of take it home and read and study and that kind of thing. And I just tell them, like, if you're your first time, we're a church of nerds. Like it might not be for everybody, but like those of us who are here, we're really geeking out about it. So thanks for thanks for choosing us this Sunday. Anyway, man, thank you so much for coming on. How do people get connected with you? How do they get your various books that you're writing, stuff that you're working on? How do they stay connected?
Thanks, totally. So my website, it's joshuaryanbutler.com. It's just my full name. It's got, yeah, all my books are out on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, wherever books are sold. If they're interested, my mostly social media, I'm most interactive on Instagram. So it's at Josh Butler PDX, if I remember right. Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram there. And those are probably the two best ways to connect with me.
Wonderful. Well, I really enjoyed it. Like I said, really exciting podcast. When you interview scholars, and this is just fun facts for everyone who's watching. Sometimes you read their books and you're just like, dude, this is the most exciting thing I've ever read. And then you talk to them in person and it's like watching paint dry. And you're like, oh no, it's one of those. But hey, regardless, the information is good and we get built up by it either way. This is a unique opportunity where not only is the information good, but it's a really exciting conversation. So I appreciate that. Guys, if you're out there, you want to stay up to date on all the different stuff, Remnant Radio, you want to watch paint dry with us, hit that subscribe button, like the videos. We're coming out with content like this all the time. Thank you so much for tuning in, guys, and we'll see you next time.